Hi everyone, Evelina from Arcadier here. Today on Inspire, we have Jacek Rolnik, Senior Director of Global Business Services at Blueback Global, a services provider that specializes in international expansion and operations solutions. They help businesses with a variety of issues such as finance, HR, tax, and entity structuring. Hi Jacek, thanks for joining us today. How are you?
Hi, Evelina. I'm great. How are you?
I'm wonderful. Thank you so
Great.
much for joining us again. Maybe you can just tell a little bit about yourself and what you'll be speaking about.
Sure, of course, my pleasure. So as you said, my name is Jacek, and I'm a senior director here at Blueback Global. We are based in California, and as you said, we provide outsourced solutions and specialize in international setup and providing ongoing back office operations. And today I'm hoping to talk to you a little bit about the foundations of taking a business abroad. So just let me know if I can get started here.
Wonderful. Yep. Would love to jump right in with you.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Let's do it. So obviously deciding to go global, whether that's through organic growth or hiring expansion or a merger and acquisition, it's a massive undertaking full of many unknowns and different considerations. It can oftentimes paralyze even the most experienced leaders. So here at Blueback, our services are designed to alleviate some of those fears and challenges and to make the expansion process quicker, easier, and more profitable, hopefully. So I'm going to walk you through at a very high level some of the fundamentals of going abroad. Basically from launching the business to ongoing operations. And by no means will this be an exhaustive overview of all of the considerations and all of the elements that go into the decision making, but it should at least provide a sense of some of the important pieces and some of the important questions that a company should be thinking about and asking themselves as they contemplate a venture overseas. Okay, so it'll probably come as no surprise to anyone that international expansion is a complex process, and it involves many disciplines and, as I mentioned, areas for consideration. It's not just HR and the global mobility elements, although certainly those are important pieces. There are many more indeed that exist, and here is a quick list of the key considerations and topics that we will review in this discussion and presentation. So first and foremost, setting up and managing the ongoing operations of the local business, what we call the operational life cycle, if you will. Then we'll take a look at the types of company structures that are generally available around the world, and what each one of them means, and more importantly, how they differ from one another. Then we will consider how to handle local banking and handle local finances. We'll take a look at employment structures. Most countries have very different laws and practices from the U.S. For employment, and maybe more importantly for terminations. This is a fundamental misunderstanding and often a misstep for American companies, I think. They will instinctively approach the process through sort of an American lens, and that can be problematic and costly in the long run. So anyway, we'll touch on some of those. We'll also look at tax and structuring factors at a very high level. That tends to be a very, as you would imagine, technical piece of the process. So that's slightly above my expertise level. We'll also touch on immigration process and, as I mentioned before, mobility and relocation. And then we'll finish with some Q&A with our hosts. Okay. So now let's look at that operations life cycle that I mentioned. So these are the things that you want to be thinking about and planning as you prepare to go international and then begin the process of actually setting up. So first you have the initial analysis or the situational diagnostic. So that has to do with where do you want to go and why, right? The company founders and decision makers will want to examine overall company goals and purposes, looking at cost and barriers to entry, the ease of doing business in the markets that are being considered. Questions like, is your company and or product a good fit for this market? Is any localization of the product or company, for that matter, really needed? Is the company even ready to make that jump? Are management and stakeholders on board and prepared for the both the technical challenges, but also some of the cultural factors that are present in making that step? Speaking of cultural factors, is the company planning any training for its staff? Is there plans to spend any time on the ground ahead of the actual move? Is there long-term commitment? Things like that. Then obviously the footprint. So once you've chosen the location of the venture, you need to set up the legal presence and operations and the structure of the entity and the employment system that you're going to utilize. Then there's the actual implementation. So actually standing up the company, taking care of all of the registrations and employee onboarding, and of course, operationalizing the business and making it active locally. And then finally, maintenance, which is what we do a lot of here at Blueback, in addition to the setup. And that's the ongoing operational support and statutory compliance to guarantee that all required obligations, tax requirements are understood and performed as needed, and that employees obviously get paid. So now let's look at the different types of companies that you can establish internationally. That oftentimes they'll be called different things and differ slightly in the legal terms. But for the most part, they sort of follow three general frameworks, which are somewhat consistent throughout the world. There's the concept of a representative office, there's a branch, and then there's the full-blown subsidiary. When choosing the appropriate entity, the company will want to already have performed a solid analysis of what type of entity is best for your business and needs and overall goals locally. There are some characteristics and trade-offs, as presented here in this chart, that you may have to keep in mind when considering the three different options and classifications. So from our perspective, the most commonly chosen method for our clients is a subsidiary, which is a separate legal company from the home entity, much like a corporation or an Inc. in the United States. It's not a branch, although these two are sometimes confused and often used interchangeably. But what that means is that in the case of the subsidiary, all liabilities are limited to that subsidiary. The parent company doesn't inherit any of the risks or the legal exposure from the local market. From a legal standpoint, that might be preferable to a company looking to expand, as it protects obviously the home entity and offers what's called an arm's length relationship between the two companies. And subsidiaries will usually also carry less restrictions on the allowed sort of activities than some of the other options locally. And that's because it's considered a local independent company, so it has more latitude and leeway. And of course, there's the incentives, and usually in the way of tax incentives or credits or even tax holidays for the investment into the country. That being said, subsidiaries do also carry more compliance burden. There's typically more ongoing maintenance for that type of company, and potentially more cost as full-fledged independent entities in the host country. Branches are an extension of the parent company, unlike the subsidiary. So naturally, they carry more risk for that home company. Activities may be limited in this case, and tax incentive, and the like may not exist, as local governments typically prefer and incentivize the more long-term investment and the local revenue generation, which is typically characteristic of the subsidiary. The representative office is the lightest presence, if you will, and that is typically highly regulated in terms of what it can do locally. Usually it's limited to basically marketing initiatives, marketing support, and business feasibility studies and research. And in that case, all liability extends to the parent company. Next, we have, so I covered most of these points already in some of the comments that I just made, but to summarize some of the important factors in structuring, with the larger separation of legal liability and the tax presence, obviously comes more maintenance and potentially some additional cost. So that's in the case of a subsidiary. Some of the exit procedures and wind down processes can be cumbersome for subsidiaries. Activities, as I mentioned, will vary by entity type, and generally are very restricted for rep offices in the host country. And then, of course, there is the consideration of not-for-profit companies and registrations, and that in and of itself could be a separate presentation. So in terms of banking and treasury and finances, setting up local bank accounts, which are generally required for local funding, can be quite a cumbersome process in some countries. And furthermore, regulations and due diligence practices around that process have become more stringent and more burdensome over time. Examples of this are the FATCA guidelines in the US, as well as the KYC, or Know Your Customer, policies in the UK and elsewhere around the world. So our clients will often rely on trust accounts, which are essentially set up for their purposes by our local representatives for them to use. And what that means is that the bank account will be held by an established local company on behalf of the client. And if it's possible, it's best to also leverage existing banking relationships throughout the world if you're not using the trust account. So banks like HSBC or Barclays, if you have a relationship with them in one country, you can oftentimes leverage that relationship to set up an account elsewhere. And it's important to notice that it's important to note that oftentimes the structure of the parent company can also affect the ease of bank account setup, depending on how complex that structure is. So if there's ownership by several companies, VCs, things like that, where there's sort of entities behind entities of ownership, the banks will ultimately want to trace it back to a few individuals. So that can be quite a cumbersome process. Probably not for a startup, but more for larger companies. In terms of employment, so employment is usually one of the key factors in the decision making in terms of both legal entity structure and market entry, really. There are a few different ways in which you can hire resources locally. You can do independent contractors. You can do what's called an employer of record, or a PEO or GEO model, where the employee is essentially leased to you via a local company that provides an employment service, a third party. And of course, there's outright employment by the local entity. All are legitimate options and require prior assessment and knowledge of the local situation and laws, and many of that varies from country to country. I would strongly urge companies to be careful when thinking about hiring self-employed contractors outside of the US. This approach can can come with some serious consequences down the line. It may initially seem to be the fastest and easiest way to get somebody on board and to establish a local presence and get boots on the ground. But in reality, that's not always the case. You need to ensure that the contractor is behaving as a contractor, right? So it needs to be part-time, no benefits allowed. Other characteristics of a contractor need to exist. If that contractor is deemed to be essentially a misclassification by the local authorities and turns out to be a bona fide employee, the company could face significant tax liability down the road. Backlog of payroll and withholding taxes and potentially other liabilities, as well as fines, and in some cases even interest on what's been owed. And that can go back several years depending on the situation. So it may seem like a low exposure type thing if you're only talking about one or two contractors, but we have really seen this to come back to haunt companies down the road, as sometimes the contractor, him or herself, will in fact tip off authorities and pursue the company for additional payouts and benefits after parting ways. So just something to be not to be cynical, but something to be very, aware of in terms of long-term planning. Not to say that, you shouldn't do it. Obviously, independent contractors are a very feasible way to get your feet wet, so to speak. And it's a natural, I think, progression oftentimes. But just have to use caution, to make sure that you are really intending to have this person serve as a contractor and not more. The PEO or EOR, employer of record or professional employment organization model, can be a very effective short-term solution, but it has its own drawbacks and limitations, and it can be quite costly, especially with increased headcount and sort of long-term growth. For full-time or outright employment, it's important that a company understands local laws, requirements, and common practices. As I mentioned earlier, oftentimes the companies will make the mistake of just assuming that things are the same in other countries, and that's oftentimes the case of American companies. So, it's important to really do some research on that before making the decision. Employer, obligations to the employee and statutory requirements in terms of social benefits and insurances, pensions, all sorts of, auxiliary benefits can be very specific and costly to countries. So again, for thorough analysis is recommended. And then of course there are also immigration and visa or employment pass and mobility relocation, considerations that a company will want to think about if the person's a foreigner. Tax can also play a big factor here, particularly for expats, as they will not want to be in any way disadvantaged by the move. So oftentimes what HR and companies will go through is a tax normalization or equalization process on that front. So that's something to think about. The issue of employment and labor law can be one of the more challenging areas of international expansion. So obviously a thorough analysis is recommended, and legal consultation is strongly encouraged. So in terms of credits and incentives, and by that I mean mostly tax, here in this area, I really just want to touch briefly on the issue. This is a very technical matter, as you would probably assume, and I would certainly recommend expert advice in this area. But initially, it's important to at least have a general understanding, that certain countries will have tax agreements with one another, and that makes the two-way relationship in that scenario preferable from a tax optimization perspective. So, oftentimes governments will offer incentives or credits, in some cases actually long-term tax holidays, to attract local investment. and local employment of the in-country population. But that said, it's also important to know that, you know, at times that can come with some strings attached, so to speak. So it's important to really vet this through and get professional insight. And then on the slide here, I noted a few examples of countries that are known for tax privileges: Switzerland, Netherlands, and Singapore. Oh, that's it. Okay. So again, this presentation, you know, provides a very high level, quick baseline primer, essentially, on some of the basic considerations that companies should think about if they're moving abroad. There's certainly much more to it than this, and it involves layers of technical details, you know, beyond my skill and expertise and time that we have here. But you know, generally speaking, it's best to work with global experts and consultants, you know, such as ourselves, but there's certainly other firms, CPAs and lawyers and things, you know, and people like that on some of those more technical elements. I think particularly when it comes to tax factors, labor laws, and, you know, some of the statutory and regulatory compliance matters. Because again, we've seen a lot of companies, and I think this is particularly the case for smaller companies or startups where resources are tight and people need to make decisions quickly. Oftentimes they'll decide to go it alone for cost savings purposes, but that more often than not, I think, becomes a disadvantage down the road. So anyway, hopefully this provides, you know, at least a good gist of some of the inherent complexity of international business. And if we can be of any further assistance, please feel free to get in touch with us through our website at bluebackglobal.com. Thanks, Evelina.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jacek. That was extremely insightful. Lots of information being shared. Definitely have a lot of questions.
Okay.
So to start, for new entrepreneurs and business owners with specifically Arcadia, but just in general, many have just started. And in order to eventually expand, what do they need to do in their own countries first? And at what point should they consider the different types of legal organizational structures that you mentioned, whether it's an entity or a partnership?
Right. So, I suppose similar principles really apply, whether it's you know, growing beyond your home borders or even, you know, domestically. I think, you know, key to that is do you have, you know, an overall growth strategy? I think every company should have that. Some planning is required there. You know, have you outgrown your current structure? Have you saturated your market, your domestic market? You know, what is your overall situation domestically? Is there new or greater opportunity elsewhere? And in addition to geographical expansion, I think companies will probably want to think about expanding in the sense of products and services, right? How can you do more with what you have? Are there natural derivatives or extensions of your product that make sense to further increase, you know, sales and revenue without necessarily going abroad? But I don't think they have to be mutually exclusive. I think all of that should be part of your overall growth strategy and planning.
And then in one of your first slides, you were talking about the life cycle.
Yeah.
Curious to know, where do startups tend to get stuck or have troubles within that life cycle?
Yeah, so I don't, you know, honestly, I'm not sure that there is a startup specific angle really here. I think for the most part, this process is pretty much the same across the board for companies of all sizes. But that said, obviously, you know, being a startup with the smaller size of the company and presumably, you know, limited resources, the company probably wants to plan better and, you know, and solicit advice and help more and earlier. You know, finances and capital requirements are something you obviously want to have a good grasp of before making that venture abroad. And then, you know, I think I mentioned this earlier in my presentation, you know, one of the things that we see is a lot of startups and smaller companies will try to take the DIY approach and try to do things themselves. And again, that can be costly in the long run. Sometimes mistakes, you know, can be more costly and more difficult to undo than just to get that guidance and information in advance.
Yeah, sometimes just seeking a professional is the best course of action.
Exactly, that's right.
So I guess speaking about banks, you spoke about the complexities and regulations of setting up a bank account. A lot of startups and everybody who's listening from Arcadia would be probably using Stripe and PayPal to receive funds and pay their sellers. How does this type of startup model using other payment gateways fit into, or eventually need to change into a more traditional method or structure that you've outlined?
Sure. So, you know, I truthfully, I don't have a ton of experience with that scenario where it's a early, you know, startup kind of entry. But, you know, I think, you know, the scenario that you're proposing where, you know, startup is using PayPal or similar services, that's a very transactional process. So you can facilitate, you know, some payments through that method. But if you have no, you know, banking facilities, some of the larger financial processes can be very difficult. You know, you certainly can't pay taxes, for example, through PayPal or, you know, things like that. So in a lot of, you know, instances, to establish an entity, it's actually a requirement to have a bank account, right? And then, for example, if there's a requirement for capital investment up front, that needs to be made into a local bank account. So again, I don't have all the nuances in terms of, you know, how to best do that as a startup per se. But I think, you know, I think in many instances it would be very difficult to do business locally without having the banking facilities in place.
Yeah. So obviously, lots of companies are interested in going overseas and expanding. What are some good reasons for expanding overseas? And what are some reasons maybe that a company or a small company might not want to expand?
Well, I think that kind of goes back to the first question that we had, right? You know, I mean, obviously, if there's an opportunity, right? If there's a business opportunity for your product to gain market share, you want to capitalize on that. You know, one of the things that I think needs to also be considered is the competitive landscape, right? In addition to some of the things that I mentioned earlier in terms of, does the product make sense, right? Both from a utilization perspective, but also from a cost perspective. I mean, there are some, you know, products where in some countries they won't work because it's just going to be very difficult to have the local population be able to afford it or utilize it. What's the infrastructure like in that country? Can the infrastructure there support your service or your product? So things like that. Again, more of the softer elements that sometimes people don't think about. What are not good reasons for expanding overseas? I don't know that there is one. I guess it comes down to level of maturity, right? Is the company, is the company ready for that step? Are there legitimate needs? Is it part of your growth plan? Again, I think it's very important, even for, even as you start with us, early on with a startup and really aren't maybe even thinking about international expansion yet. It's still important to have a growth strategy and think about 5 years, 10 years down the road. If you meet all of your objectives, then what? It shouldn't be it should be, sort of on the fly whimsical decision.
All right, so definitely don't just say, tomorrow, let's just expand overseas.
Right.
So
Right.
once they
Good
do
luck doing that if that's what you do, but
very ambitious.
yes.
So let's say a company decides that they want to expand overseas. What might a small company, any advice of what they should not do as they enter a new country? Any advice you're clear of?
Yeah. I mean, I think I said this already a couple times. I would say don't go it alone. I think it may seem like the better or cheaper way to do that, but honestly, I think professional advice, local expert advice, because again, professional, you could have a tax accountant from Brazil, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend using him if you're expanding to Singapore. So again, it's the expert advice, but also the local expertise, right? We've time and again, we've seen companies make some pretty big mistakes because they just didn't do enough planning and consultation in advance. So I would say that's the biggest thing. Just don't go it alone.
Very solid advice. Thank you for that. So to wrap up, my last question is, what's one piece of advice that you would like to give everyone today that's listening?
Life advice or
anything, life advice, business advice, anything that you think is most pertinent.
Yeah. I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I really like this. I say this a lot. Don't go it alone. I mean, I think, and particularly I think with entrepreneurs and startup folk, and I spent a lot, many years in that world. And actually, we are still a startup. We're a very small company, and independent and self-funded. So, I think oftentimes the inclination is because of the culture and the spirit, I think, is to kind of, be mavericks and in fact go it alone. But I think these are very serious decisions that can have very long-term implications. So I would say definitely get the professional expert advice and make sure that that there is planning and strategy behind any kind of move internationally.
Don't go at it alone. Very important.
And actually applies to life too.
That's life and business advice from Jacek Rolnik. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And just to reiterate, what's the best way for anybody who's interested or wants to reach out to get in touch with you?
Probably through our website. So again, it's www.bluebackglobal.com.
All right, great. Thank you so much again, Jacek, for joining us. And thank you everyone for tuning in to today's session of Inspire. Until next time, be inspired.
Thanks, Evelina. Thanks, everyone.